Hi, this is Ryan from Clovis Star. It's August 15th, 2017. It's a little over a day after this incident in Charlottesville, Virginia, took place where a young lady, 32 years old, her name was Heather Heyer, I believe, Heyer, and I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. Anyway, she died in a tragic accident where a man ran over her and apparently 19 others that were injured in this big protest against the Unite the Right. So I don't know what happened, whether the guy got scared and hit the gas because he was being attacked. You see, after he hit the lady, after he ran over the people, there's a mob of them on his car with bats beating the hell out of his car, smashing windows, and they were armed fairly well, all these protesters. And that's pretty common, you see this in the BLM riots, the Black Lives Matter, you see this in the Antifa counter-protest, and what happened in Berkeley, these people come to things that, aren't organized by them. They come to other people's things and they riot, they fight, they hurt, they maim. That, guy that got hit in the head with a bike lock in Berkeley, damn near, he's lucky to have lived. He got hit really hard, smashed his head pretty good. Anyway, so whatever the case, this young lady, I think she was a mother, and she lost her life over this. I noticed as the incident happened, just watching the footage, these people are in the street, obviously where cars drive. That was their first mistake. Secondly, they're saying our streets, whose streets, our streets, they're defying people to run them over. They're defying people to, drive there, saying, oh, yeah, these are our streets, you can't drive here. And they block traffic. They do this often. Several over the years have been hit over these, protesters blocking the road. Several people have been hit and hurt seriously. I don't know if anybody else has been killed, but people have been ran over. And, in the court, when, things are play out in court, the people that have ran over these protesters usually get no charges because, obviously the road is not for walking and protesting, it's for driving. And so when people go out there and they, protest in the middle of a road and block a road, they're sort of, risking their life, I'd say. I'm not trying to make light of this situation. It's terrible. This lady was killed. And it's also, it's pertinent to say, and I think it should be said more often, that both of these sides, whether it be the white nationalists or the black nationalists, or the black rights or the white rights or the whatever, it's so petty. When it comes down to it, and this is why we moved out of the States and into the islands. We live in Puerto Rico. There is no racism here. There literally is no racism here. Everybody is, whether they're light skin or dark skin, they're just people. And that's how I like to see it. We look at history, we look at figures like Jesus. He was clearly not Caucasian. He had ancestors from North Africa, and he was very, likely to be a dark-skinned person. Yet, these groups, depending on their identity, will say, oh, Jesus was black, oh, Jesus was white. He's probably somewhere in between, and it doesn't really matter. What he sacrificed, what he gave, the life he lived and the example he set is what matters. It's not about his skin color. It's not about his heritage. It's about, his life and his duty to mankind and what he did for us. And others as well. You look at what they're protesting too. You look at, they're trying to take a statue down of General Robert E. Lee. And you compare the two generals at the time on the factions, the opposing factions. You look at Ulysses S. Grant. He was a slave owner. He was from the North, from the Union. Robert E. Lee never owned a slave. Everybody's like, oh, this is a racist statue. Robert E. Lee was a racist. Get your facts straight. Do a little history. Because these facts are important. When it comes to fighting and rioting and causing, great harm and damage in society, you really ought to get your facts straight because there's a lot more to that war than slavery. And if you get back into it, in history and what it was all about, you look at the first slave owner that was legally allowed to own slaves. He was a black man from Angola named Anthony Johnson, who in Virginia, in the colony of Virginia in 1640, sued to be allowed legally to own a slave. And he was granted that exception. And that's what, in court, legally made slavery legal in the United States. That was the first case where it was justified in court, set by case law and precedents, that was a legal practice to own slaves. And he owned 4 white slaves and 1 black slave at that time in 1640. So, and you look at, beyond that, of course, white people were more dominant in that society, and so they were looking for, ways, to rise up out of that predicament of slavery. Many of them came over from Ireland, England, other places as indentured servants. And then, of course, their slave owners or their contract holders would change their contracts to be a lifelong contract. Despite it was usually a 10-year contract, the courts wouldn't hear out an indentured servant in court. Typically, they would go with the contract owner, whatever they said. Even if the indentured servant was like, no, it was only a 10-year contract. What are they going to do? It's their word against the contract owner, the slave master. And so many white people were slaves, and they were looking for a way to scapegoat the black people to rise up out of that predicament so they didn't have to be slaves. And that's how, the racist factor entered United States in slavery, is that, white slaves wanted, a way out. And so they found that by marginalizing black people. But it started out where skin color was not an issue. And then later on, up until even the end of the Civil War, there was as many of the percentage of black people that owned slaves in the United States as there was the percentage of white people that owned slaves. So surely there was less black people that owned slaves, but if we're talking about a per capita basis, saying roughly 10 to 12% of Americans were black or African American, there was roughly 5% of that group, 4 to 5% of that group that owned slaves. And same with the whites, that were roughly 75% of the population. Roughly 5% of whites owned slaves. So they both had slaves, both colors, both heritages, nationalities, whatever you want to call them, had about as equal in per capita rates as the other in slavery. This whole fight is stupid. It's like what I've always said about pro sports. I think pro sports is stupid because you have this identity. You're like, oh, I'm a Raiders fan till the end, man. Like, what does that even mean? Who cares? Like, what? Because they make millions of dollars throwing a pigskin around? They do absolutely nothing for society, these pro sports players. They go, make millions of dollars, spend it recklessly, usually end up with nothing to show for it, and do nothing productive with their time except for play a game. And everyone's like, oh, my identity is the Seahawks. Oh, man, I'm all Seahawks this year. Yeah, Seahawks for life. I mean, what is that? They waste so much time and energy on it. It's the same thing with racists, saying, oh, my heritage, that's my identity, blah, blah. Like, whether they're white, black, or purple, it doesn't really matter. We're all human. There's one race. There's not multiple races or multiple species in the human race. There's just one race with different melanin. That's all. And no one's better or worse than the other based on that. It just doesn't make any sense. And it weakens us as a group to, section ourselves out like that and fight against each other because we don't make any progress. When we're fighting against each other, we're not united, and we're not fighting against the things that are hurting us, like bankers and, elite, warmongers and warlords. I mean, we're not fighting against the real problems in this world when we're fighting against each other. And that's the way they like it. You look at people like George Soros, one of my least favorite people, because of what he does, not because of who he is, but he funds racists on one side. I think it was in Poland. He had funded a racist group on that side, whites that were like neo-Nazi types. And then he will fund the other side as well. And like in the United States, he's funding the Black Lives Matter, just so that there's chaos and there's discord. And that's what these people like. They like discord. So I won't have anything of it. I think we should get on with our lives and, stop going and looking for a fight. Like when the the rights, or the right side of the bird is having their own rally, or whether it's Trump having a presidential campaign rally. Antifa, Bernie supporters, and Black Lives Matter, if they don't support Trump, or if they don't support the right side of the bird, they don't need to be there with bats and weapons and mace and whatever else. They can just go have their own rally and show their own, solidarity in whatever they believe. They don't need to go and disrupt other people and start fights and start causing this violence. There's no need for it. And so I denounce the violence on both sides, and I definitely denounce the racism on both sides, and there's a lot of it on both sides. I think we need to get past that and be, more evolved people instead of worrying about these stupid little idiosyncrasies about our species. Thanks for tuning in. Check us out at clovistar.com.